This is the Polistratics Podcast, where we discuss policies, strategies, and tactics that shape the Middle East and the world. My name is Nawaf Al-Thani, and I'm the President of the Council on International Mediation, Episode 2, Inside the Escalation. In 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The world changed, and Lyndon Baines Johnson became the President of the United States. In November of that year, he vowed to have a quick win in Vietnam and exit. Unfortunately, he went through and entered the escalation ladder. What happened after that was, now we look back, is something that was almost expected. The limited retaliatory action in August of 1964 escalated to a full sustained military involvement by February and March of 1965. That was the Vietnam War. Now, with the war going on in the Gulf currently, the U.S.-Israeli-Iran war, is the United States entering another escalation ladder? And how is that escalation shaping in this part of the world? When we recorded this episode, Ali Larijani was in his final last hours. We found out after recording this episode that the National Security Advisor of Iran was in fact assassinated. And that's why we start off by pointing out his letter that he points out an off-ramp. The question is those views still valid by whomever is running right now the Iranian regime? And how does the United States avoid another escalation ladder into a full-fledged war? This time probably a global war with global ramifications that will go across economic, social, and obviously humanitarian areas that will affect every individual on the planet. My guest today is Dr. Andreas Krieg. Andreas is a geopolitical risk analyst and strategic consultant with over 20 years experience in the Middle East and North Africa. He has worked with professional military and civilian services and education for nearly 15 years across the UK defence and overseas. He is also an associate professor at King's College London's School of Security Studies and the UK Defence Academy Royal College of Defence Studies. He is a true expert who has lived in the Middle East and witnessed its progression or regression when it comes to the defense and security sector, again, for almost 2 decades. He is going to be with us today, and hopefully he can shed more light on this escalation ladder to talk about the war from Europe, from inside the escalation. Dr. Andreas Krieg. Andreas, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Andreas, when I started my monologue, we tried to give just an idea of where we are. We're now in week 3 of the war. We've had a letter circulating with demands or suggestions or musings from Ali Larijani. I think it's Iranians' attempt at finding an off-ramp or something. I don't know if you had a chance to have a look at that letter. And obviously, the situation with Krieg and the escalation, or what looks like an escalation in the war from the American side. So my first question to you is, how's the war going on from where you sit? You're in the United Kingdom, but you've been, as I mentioned in the intro, an expert, and you've lived and worked here. How do you see it?
Well, I've came to the Gulf probably first time 14 years ago. And obviously there's a part of me that I left in the Gulf, and obviously spent many, many years in Qatar and keep on traveling through the Gulf, multiple times a year. So this is a region which is very close to my heart. So I follow it very closely. And I think for the first time in a long time, but certainly over the last couple of years, we've seen more and more interest in the Gulf. And now very much the Gulf is right at the heart of public interest, market interest, and so on and so forth. I have to say the sort of consultations, advice that people are seeking on this region over the last 2.5 weeks is unprecedented for me. I've never seen that many people from such diverse backgrounds wanting to know what's going on. And obviously UK plays quite an important role from a market point of view, not just financial markets, but particularly in terms of shipping and also insurance. This is a very important sort of part of what, you know, the kind of remnant of British Empire is the fact that they're still very dominant in shipping and insurance. And so, you know, speaking to people in the City of London, they're very concerned, obviously, in terms of what's going to happen to vessels passing through the choke point of the Strait of Hormuz. So London seems kind of far away, but it's not. And obviously, since Donald Trump, he seems to be quite desperate now to move out of this quagmire and getting out of this spiral of escalation. He's not doing a very good job at this. But as he's trying to get out of it, he's trying to now share the burden, or tries to find useful idiots who would want to share the burden with him in Europe. So there's been a lot of pressure on the UK as well now to come out and support whatever, you know, kind of plan he has in place to open up the Strait of Hormuz. None of this really, as I see it, seems to be a feasible option. I don't think there is a military option to open up the Straits of Hormuz. And there's very little that the British government can do at this point, also in terms of our Navy. The Royal Navy doesn't have the capacity and capability anymore to kind of operate that far away, considering that we're also kind of in a war with Russia.
Well, last time we spoke about the city, and I know you're very familiar with the city, and we were in London in November, and I had told you about my intrigue about, you know, how the mechanisms of the city. But today in the news, Al Jazeera was reporting, and many other outlets, that insurance is now 5 times what it was before the war. I think it's 5% of the cost of the vessel, or something like that. That seems pretty steep to, you know, as one American friend told me, you guys should, you know, have a go at it. Do you think the Gulf states, the GCC countries, should have just a go at it while, you know, the Strait of Hormuz is this volatile at this point?
100%. Because the problem with markets are entirely driven by human emotions and human psychology. And the problem that a lot of people who sit maybe in London who've never been to the Gulf and don't necessarily involve much with Gulf affairs, just look at the images that are coming out of the Gulf, which look very scary. And I'm not downplaying it, you know, seeing oil depots on fire, seeing vessels being attacked, you know, all drone alarms, drones hitting urban centers across the Gulf. Very scary stuff. I don't want to downplay this, but after all, it's the sort of risk that Europeans might be willing to endure, and also that markets might be willing to endure, might be very different to what Gulf states might endure. And I think ultimately it comes down to confidence, isn't it? And confidence in the market, confidence in Iran, and also the different players around the Strait of Hormuz being able to keep it open and not attack vessels. I do think that countries like Qatar and also Oman have a potentially very unique role to play in this, because they're mediators. And I think as mediators, they have back channels and sort of communication links with the Iranians to get a better idea of whether it's safe or not to pass through this strait. And Qatar obviously has a massive fleet itself of LNG tankers that it could decide to underwrite itself and could insure itself and basically back it up with sovereign capital, of which again Qatar has quite a lot. So I think why not have a go at it? Because I'm personally quite pessimistic to think that we're going to see a quick off-ramp. Maybe the war will stop and maybe we'll have a degree of a ceasefire, but I do think the freedom of navigation situation, around the Strait of Hormuz in particular, that's going to be a problem for quite some time, because the Iranians now realize that they have probably the only lever that they have in international affairs now is holding the energy markets and shipping for ransom. And they might decide to do that again, at which point, again, insurance markets might collapse. Vessels might not allow to go through, despite the fact that, you know, the strait is, you know, not open, but there are varying degrees for different types of companies and different types of shipping companies and insurances. So I think it's a good time for the Gulf to think about maybe doing it themselves.
Well, I mean, you look at the escalation ladder of the war right now, and talking about shipping and hydrocarbons in general, whether natural gas or oil. The President of the United States has alluded to probably taking control of Kharj Island, which is a main terminal for Iran for exporting oil, after obviously the bombings that happened a few days ago of the island. Is the U.S. trying to put Iran in as much a pain as he believes the Europeans are? What's the plan do you see there?
I don't think there is a plan, unfortunately. I have very little confidence in this administration that they come up with a plan and that they actually think about second and third order effects in terms of thinking through the different activities that they have been executing for the last 2.5 weeks. Doesn't really give me any confidence that they're planning things through. It seems to be a bit of a strategic tit for tat. So the Iranians are closing the strait effectively, and now Trump, instead of thinking maybe we should engage, maybe there's a way to find an off-ramp, we're doubling down and we're going to escalate further, which is a very Trumpian thing to do. Trump is not someone to back down. He believes in diplomacy through coercion and compulsion. And so I think that's part of that, of him thinking, okay, if we take over all these terminals, we're going to not necessarily bankrupt Iran, because Iran has a lot of other avenues to get oil out and gas out of the country. But it would certainly be a heavy blow to the Iranian economy, but to which I think the Iranians will respond in kind, which is striking Gulf terminals, which they're already doing, and Gulf ports and oil wells and refineries and the entire hydrocarbon infrastructure that makes the Gulf what it is today. So they're doing it already, but I think there is room for the Iranians to kind of gear it up a notch and potentially escalate further, doing so more indiscriminately, doing it with more heavy weaponry, more difficult to intercept. If we saw these sort of cluster munitions that have been thrown at Kuwait, and I think potentially at the UAE, but certainly at Israel, if we'd see those being fired at Ras Laffan in Qatar, or other terminals and major oil fields in Saudi Arabia, that could cause the sort of damage that could be lasting. And that's not something. It's a sort of fire you don't want to play with, I think.
Now, obviously, the Iranians are getting closer and closer to the point of no return when it comes with the future relations with the GCC. And that risks any future cooperation, but Iran obviously views it as existential right now. But, speaking to a few folks in Europe and America, they thought, well, Iran sending a message and pressuring the GCC by, sending more than double the munitions, rockets, drones, and all of those to the GCC than they did to Israel. Maybe the first week, 10 days was a message, and now it seems like, no, they're committed to that. Today we had 2 barrages here in Qatar, 15 ballistic missiles, swarms of drones, and obviously UAE, Kuwait, Saudi, Bahrain. No one's unscathed, even Oman. So what's the Iranian view from where you stand? What's the off-ramp for them in a future sense, not just ending the war, but how can they continue with a relationship with the GCC?
I think they opened Pandora's box, and the Israelis certainly opened it, and the Iranians opened it even a bit further. Unfortunately, I find the Gulf is somewhat stuck between 2 pariah states that don't have Gulf interests in mind at all, and are willing to use or fight each other to the last Gulfie, rather than fighting each other directly. And the problem is the Gulf, because it seeks stability, because it has obviously financial wealth, it is the most stable outside of this conflict, the most stable, most sustainable part of the Middle East, even more so than Israel. More stable politically, economically, socially. And so they knew that this need for stability that the Gulf states have means that they are the kind of the weak spot. They're the Achilles heel, if you will, for global markets, for the United States as well. And I think this is something that has now taught them. We always, every sort of, how many war games have we had over the last couple of years, decades, to play through the scenarios of a war with Iran and what Iran would do? It's not like we didn't plan for it. We knew that could happen, but obviously they went completely nuclear quite quickly. And I think it now showed them that this is no longer just a theory. There's something that they can use. And I think it has really lowered the threshold for Iran to do this next time around. I would also say that the strike on Qatar last year in June, which obviously the Qataris very quickly transformed into an opportunity for an off-ramp and mediation, it crossed a red line that made what happened this year more easily, more acceptable in Iran. And so every single time they do it and they get away with it, it will set a new sort of deterrence, balance of deterrence, if you will, where at this point it's not really a balance. I think deterrence has been kind of lost on the side of the Gulfies. And I don't know what would have to happen for the Gulfies to say, okay, that's it, you crossed the red line, we're going to strike directly and we're going to get involved. I'd probably say if it wasn't for Israel being part and running and orchestrating this war and also dragging the Americans into this war, maybe the Gulfies would have been more ready to respond to it. Because obviously you're in that weird predicament of, on the one hand, you need to defend yourself, which is what you're doing, but equally you don't want to get sucked into an Israeli war against Iran, which is essentially not your war. After all, I mean, this is geography, right? You're prisoners of that geography, and that geography is not going to go anywhere. You will have to remain, you have to survive, you have to coexist next to whatever's left of the regime or whatever new regime might be created in Iran. And I find that a difficult thing to forecast, because you don't want to live next to a country with which you are in permanent war, permanent conflict. But as it seems now, more than 2 weeks in, it seems like Iran doesn't really care to keep this a perma-crisis and a permanent war. But I do have some slight hope that through mediation, negotiation, bilaterally, some of the Gulf states can have a different, a special relationship with that regime in Iran, while others can't, and certainly might have a better relationship with that regime in Iran than, let's say, the United States or other European countries.
So before we get to Israel, I want to ask you about this ladder of escalation, just to try to, graph it out, see where it goes. Now, if the U.S. takes over the island, Kharj Island, which is the main Gulf terminal, let's be very specific, the Gulf terminal for its oil. You mentioned there are other ways that Iran could export its oil and gas. But if it takes that escalation and Iran retaliates, whether in kind or kinetically in another way, isn't the U.S. now entering, if it does that, would be entering into a Lyndon B. Johnson kind of an approach of, same thing with the U.S. and Vietnam. Now we have to go to the next step and there's no way back. Would even if the president of the United States decided, I'm ending the war today, would Iran end it?
I think two different questions. I think, first of all, highly doubtful that if the US was calling it quits and said, mission accomplished, we won this and we're disengaging, questionable whether the Iranians will just tone down their attacks on shipping and potentially what they call, US sort of targets in the Gulf, which is a very ambiguous term.
Yes.
But
just like school, what they call schools and residential areas here in Qatar and the rest of the GCC, American targets.
Mostly, all of it civilian targets, whether American or not civilian targets, thereby war crimes in itself. We don't have to talk about it. Obviously, that's absolutely illegal. And any sort of moral high ground, and I'm not suggesting Iran ever had a moral high ground, but any moral high ground they were taking vis-a-vis Israel and their targeting of civilian infrastructure in Gaza has been completely eradicated by them deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure in the Gulf. But that's a slightly separate story. But the problem is you're getting into this quagmire. If the Americans now put 2,500 boots on the ground in Kharj Island, which I think is going to be difficult for a variety of different reasons, because now you're on that island, you're quite close to the Iranian mainland, you're a sitting duck, because after all, you're not unlikely going to land more troops on the Iranian mainland, which means you're completely at the mercy of incoming munitions and fire directly from Iran. There are all kinds of ways for Iran to make the life of those boots on the ground a living hell, even if they don't attempt directly to take the island back. But you're going to be sitting there in a neighborhood that the United States do not control. There's another aspect here that very few people talk about. This is not because people make comparisons between the 1980s tanker war where the Americans were escorting ships in and out. It's a very different environment. This is now a hostile environment where the Iranians are directly attacking the Americans. It's an environment where the Gulf states don't support the Americans directly, where they don't have the sort of freedom of maneuver and the freedom to operate in airspace and as they might have had in other cases, because the GCC is not part of Israel's war against the Iranians. So it's a very difficult, logistically, a very difficult thing to maintain, and maintaining this kind of bridgehead. And it's not more than a bridgehead if you don't move further in. But if you do move further in and want to sustain it, you need more boots on the ground. And then, you get into mission creep where, as you were rightly saying, I think Vietnam also started with 2,500 Marines and then obviously went into, I think, up to 550,000 at some point. Obviously, nobody has the stomach for this in America to happen right now. I don't think we're in that sort of America where anybody would support this. But it's a quagmire. And this is the problem for President Trump, because if he wants a way out and he's still suggesting to his MAGA base that this is an excursion and it will finish very soon, once you put boots on the ground, you're committed. You're committed for a few months at least. And what happens in these few months could be another sort of escalatory move to which you're then again responding. Since there are no back channels, and there isn't really diplomacy effectively happening between the US and Iran for various reasons. Obviously, Iranians have rejected attempts. The Americans have rejected attempts. But basically, both sides are saying at the moment, particularly the Iranians are saying, we're winning this. We have escalatory dominance. We're dictating the terms. We're dictating the timings, what you're going to do about it. And at the moment, I don't see the Americans having a lot of options of, either open up the strait or making the IRGC stop. For me, Iran, as it stands now, in many ways, is a militia with a state. It's not a normal state. It's a militia like the IRGC, organized like an insurgency group. And how do you compel them to stop when really all they want to do is continuously pressure you asymmetrically, knowing you can't endure this indefinitely while they can? You need to win while they only need to survive. It's just in that asymmetry in itself. With a militia state like the IRGC state that doesn't care for their own civilians, doesn't care for Iran as a state or a civilization, willing to sacrifice it all, how are you going to create an off-ramp with these sort of guys when obviously the Americans on their side have time and again breached sort of levels of trust, crossed red lines time and again? How do you get back to some sort of normality? I think it's only for Qatar and Oman to try to build something here, but you're building something out of thin air at the moment.
Well, looking at what's going on right now, as you said, it's an escalation. It's looking more and more like Vietnam, except, looking at off ramps. If the president decided, and this is the part of my second part of the question, if the president decided to, it's victory, we're done. And the new normal is an Iran that controls and constrains the Strait of Hormuz, that still has, and if the war ends, will continue to rebuild its capabilities to strike its neighbors and Israel. What kind of a world does that make for the US's partner, Israel, that would make the U.S. go, oh, we're not coming back? Because all Israel has to say is, well, Mr. President, if you're calling it quits and you decide victory, we'll just go for another couple of weeks. Well, then the Iranians will have to hit back Israel, and the U.S. will have to be pulled back into this war by the Israelis. It seems like this is just an unending circle. What's the most likely outcome if a war would end in the next 2-3 weeks?
I think the Israelis now, obviously going into southern Lebanon, have slightly a longer timeline for this war. And certainly now that they're on a total war footing, despite all the costs that they're enduring, they're in it for a couple of more weeks, if not months.
Well,
probably months.
The U.S. taxpayers paying for those extra. I mean, the Israelis don't care about that.
Absolutely. And so Trump is, again, wherever you go, Trump is in some sort of, between a rock and a hard place, because he cannot be seen as abandoning Israel. Although a lot of people at MAGA wouldn't care at this point. If you saw the new polls coming out today, I think on NBC, about where American Democrats stand, suggests that nobody really cares about Israel anymore, and they see Israel increasingly as a pariah, as something, a free rider of U.S. power, U.S. money, U.S. bandwidth. But despite this, there are still a solid neoconservative, call it minority, 30% of whatever, maybe more, in America who say you cannot abandon the Israelis. So Israel is also dictating terms to the Americans. So the Iranians dictating the terms via the Gulf, Israel is dictating the terms via the Americans, and Trump, whatever decision he's going to make, is going to be a suboptimal one. Because on top of what you're also mentioning here, do you want to keep this job half finished? Do you want to keep the IRGC in place, emboldened, probably with more control over the clergy, with less checks and balances internally within that network state, knowing that they have the capability and the intent to potentially disrupt energy when it pleases them, potentially disrupting flow of people, goods, capital, whatever it is that goes through the Gulf as they please. This is a very unstable order. This is not the sort of order that you want. And if they now feel so emboldened that the Iranians can dictate the terms in the Gulf, that's certainly not a prospect even countries like Qatar or Oman would enjoy, even though they did have a good working relationship. But I think nothing is ever going to be, there's going to be pre-2006 and there's going to be post-2006. So I don't think the Gulf will ever be the same again, particularly with their relationship with Iran. So also for the Gulf, there isn't a good and easy way out unless the Iranians really, and I don't know if you can trust them, because I'm not talking about the government. I'm not talking about, the National Security Advisor, Larijani and Pezeshkian and so on. I'm talking about the deeper sort of cells of the IRGC, the guys in the shadows, the guys who've been also pressurizing the Guardian Council to approve Khamenei Jr. to become the supreme leader. How are you going to reach out to these kind of guys and make sure that they're not going to go completely mental and do whatever they want to do whenever they want to do it? So that level of deterrence has broken apart. And if the Americans now pull out of this equation because they're saying, we're protecting the Gulf, but actually, we're not really, there's not much we can do, because clearly the US is not a deterrent to Iran. The US is not providing anything tangible at this point apart from capabilities to the Gulf. But essentially it's the Gulf that has to pick up the pieces, stand on its own feet and do what it needs to do. And I think all of the air defenses, all of the air forces have done a remarkable job. I mean, Qatar's Air Force has not only taken out, most of the incoming ordnance and projectiles, but shot down 2 planes. I think civil defense has done an amazing job across the Gulf in preparing people how to deal with this crisis. So in many ways, this is also a kind of a testimony to the resilience of the Gulf states. But more needs to happen for this to be an effective tool of statecraft. And Ahmed bin Jassim said it, I think, last week. The fact that the Gulf needs to come together beyond the various ideological differences that might exist between the various states in the Gulf, beyond the different strategic cultures, come together and think what it is that the Gulf can do and how it can do it to actually create an effective collective defense vis-a-vis Iran, but also vis-a-vis Israel, which is able to rely on the Americans as well as rely on other partners, picking and choosing, taking from what other countries have to offer, whether this is Ukraine, some European partners, the United States, potentially the Chinese, potentially Pakistanis, put it all together in creating an internal security for the Gulf focused. Make it Gulf first, not America first, basically. And I think that's probably the way forward.
Well, I think the U.S. has trouble in making it America first these days, so I'm not sure about the Gulf. India has been more and more prominent with its relationship with Israel. We've seen India kind of reaching out to Iran to let their ships move through the strait, not their partner, the U.S. And I've been reading a lot about Indian-Israeli relationship now growing, not replacing an American ally, but because of the political reality that's going on inside the United States, probably kind of augmenting what the U.S. can provide in support strategically across the board. How do you see India's role evolving vis-a-vis the war right now? Right now they don't have any input, but could they be on one side or the other if this thing drags on?
We've been bashing the Americans for the lack of strategy and the inability to actually play the role that you would expect a superpower to roll, the fact they're unable to contain Iran. But let's talk about the multipolar world order that we've all been talking about. I mean, the question is, where is China? Where's Russia? Where's India? Where are the BRICS countries? And what are they actually bringing to the table? Because they're on the receiving end of all of this. They're probably more, harder touched, harder affected by this than, let's say, the European markets. And what are they doing about it? Yes, they're engaging with the Iranians. They're trying to find an off-ramp. They're trying to get free passage. But after all, the status quo is not sustainable for them either. And India is a very interesting case because I'm always underwhelmed by what it is that they can offer, considering how big they are, how sizable they are, what a ambition they have to become a great power. I mean, they are a great power by most conventional metrics, but they don't have the sort of, what they're lacking is a strategic culture that goes beyond their shores. I think one of the reasons India never, obviously at some point in the 16th century, they were the greatest power in the world in terms of military, in terms of economy, but they never made it beyond their sort of, direct geography in terms of extending their reach. They never reached out to Europe. They never really reached out beyond, the Indian Ocean. And this is the problem with India in terms of strategic culture. I think India doesn't have an expeditionary tradition in any way. And for them, yes, the Straits of Hormuz are in the Indian Ocean or at the periphery of the Indian Ocean, but they're not really doing anything about it. I mean, they have permanently a vessel stationed in Oman, I think in Duqm, but they're not doing anything about it. And I spoke to a very senior Indian naval officer a couple of days ago, and he was telling me, we have potential platforms in the area, but we would not sail through the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it's something that we're trying to avoid unless we really, really have to do it, because we don't trust the Iranians on this. We're trying to engage with them. We're trying to, and the sort of overarching strategic objective for them is trade, and it's a mercantile approach, which is business first. It's apolitical. We don't care about all this, Hindutva narrative that is Islamophobic, that is aligned with Israel on saying, we don't trust the Muslims and we have to get rid of political Islam, and Islam is the greatest threat to the regional order, and so on and so forth, which is all that background noise of the Hindutva movement, out of which obviously the Prime Minister Modi has arisen, and that also explains an ideological alignment between India and Israel, India and the UAE, for example. But when it comes to business, when it comes to money, the Indians are still very apolitical and non-ideological about it. They're very pragmatic, and I think it's also important to remember that the Navy or the military itself, the Indian military that dictates security policy, is a fairly apolitical institution. Apolitical in a way that they're almost an empire within the empire, a state within the state, somewhat separate from the political infighting and the weaponized narratives domestically in India. But they're not really doing anything. They're looking at their own interests, saying what's good for our interests. We can make a deal with the Emiratis. They obviously have a very intimate relationship with the Emirates, but they're buying, if they need to buy gas from Qatar, they're quite happy to do that as well. So very pragmatic, but not really in a sort of position diplomatically to exercise any leverage over the Iranians to bring them to the table and play a role of a mediator. I don't see them as a great power. They're acting more like a regional middle power, if you will.
Yes. Well, I have got two more questions, and the last question I'm very interested on your answer on. But before that, we're seeing a lot of movement, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, in Lebanon. Now, it's almost a foregone conclusion, maybe before even this episode is published, that the Israelis will either have already invaded or are about to invade southern Lebanon. Now, we've been hearing for months about Hezbollah being dead and done, and whenever in any conferences I've been in Europe or you have been in, the question of, the proxies are done. Well, Hezbollah has shown that they're not done. They've been firing, lobbing many missiles and rockets towards Israel. If nothing else, they've been taking capacity in defense from Israel from facing the Iranians, if nothing else. Now, we don't have a lot of the numbers from the ground from Israel, obviously, for operations reasons from the Israeli perspective. But now also the Houthis are, kind of revving their engines going, what, we may get into this soon. So how does Israel, with the proxies now seemingly not dead or undead at this point, risen up like zombies in the Israeli perspective at least, how can they deal with a 1982 kind of invasion of southern Lebanon that created Hezbollah in the first place in 1982?
The Israelis, I think a lot of the problems that we're seeing unfolding since the 7th of October have to do with terrible scholarship. And I have to say that as a scholar of the region, because a lot of that scholarship has been for a long time Israeli dominated, or dominated by pro-Israeli voices. A lot of what has been written about the Arab world and the Middle East, also in America, were pro-Israeli voices that have always amplified and exaggerated the Israeli capability and as well as the Israeli ability to shape outcomes, and have always downplayed Arabs and the Arabs' capability to be effective on the battlefield, which obviously, you know, goes back to 1967, 1973 and so on, where the Israelis performed very well. I think one major problem that Israel has had in the last 3 decades is that it's very bad at fighting insurgents and at fighting non-state actors. And so the axis of resistance, why it has been fairly successful, is because it's organized in a networked way. One element of that lack of understanding on the Israeli side is how Hezbollah is being set up, how the system of Hezbollah is being set up, how the system of the IRGC is set up, how the Houthis are being set up. The fact that these are hierarchical organizations, right? They're not hierarchical, they're not like a pyramid, they're horizontally organized with loads of different cells having a lot of mission command, executing campaigns as they see fit. The problem with that is you cannot degrade these kind of networks. We've seen Israel struggling to do this with Hamas. Hamas, after 2.5 years in the most unethical war in, you know, if you want to call it a war or a genocide, considering that, you know, with the Israelis have thrown all of the rules of international armed conflict out of the window. They've used excessive force. They control every little inch of this enclave, and they're still not been able to defeat them. With Hezbollah, the same thing. 2024 was a stalemate. Hezbollah didn't lose. Hezbollah was just able to contain it. They were degraded at the center, so the core was degraded. They degraded the leadership, killed the leadership. But actually, if you look at the Radwan forces, and we're seeing that now, and I've been saying this since 2024, the actual cells, the fighting cells in southern Lebanon were still very much operational, and the tactical commanders were still there. And what they've done now, they've eradicated a digital sort of command and control system and have now a completely analog one with people running from one cell to the other. There is no, you know, when they need to be integrated into a chain of command, all of this is done in analog ways. This sort of network-centric setup that also the IRGC is now displaying in Iran and that also the Houthis have been displaying means that you cannot degrade them. Military force alone will not get you far. And my bet on this is that getting up to the Litani River, which is what the IDF wants to do, right? They want to ethnically cleanse southern Lebanon and create a buffer zone like they've done in Syria, and push all the people out, but also pushing Hezbollah out, is going to be a very lengthy, very deadly, very atrocious sort of war where they're up against probably 20, 30,000 Hezbollah fighters who are still the old guard. These are not a lot of people were killed. And in that campaign in 2024, a lot of the people who were killed on the Lebanese Hezbollah side were people who were not part of the elite forces. These were people who kind of joined, you know, the kind of tactical recruits from the village defense. Now, if they're up against the Radwan forces, the IDF is going to get into a meat grinder. And I think even with their technological superiority, I'm not so sure they will compete. One more word on the Houthis in this respect. Obviously, the recognition of Somaliland as an independent country by the Israelis plays into that. And so there have been a lot of reports now that the Israelis are using that as a staging ground to cross the horn of the Bab el-Mandeb and basically go into Yemen and potentially fight the Houthis. That's another quagmire. And I think it just goes to show how deluded the Israelis are in terms of overestimating their capabilities.
Well, my last question to you, and I'm very interested to hear your answer because you've alluded to some of it in the past. You are in London right now. You're in the heart of Europe. You understand all the economic heart of Europe. The French may differ with us on where the heart of Europe is. But can the U.S. administration, this U.S. administration, coerce, and we've heard the Europeans saying, no, we'll not fight, you know, the German Chancellor, the French, they've all made it very clear, we will not be part of this war. Is it possible that they could be drawn into this war? The UK only, maybe just one country, all the Europeans? What can the US do, and could they be successful in bringing and widening the conflict by bringing in the Europeans?
Now, Donald Trump in particular has understood, like no other president, how to weaponize the interdependence of the Western system, which is dominated by the US in terms of dollars, in terms of military and defense, in terms of economy at large. He understands that his Western partners in Europe in particular are integrated into a system since the Second World War that is US-centric, that gives the US disproportionate power and leverage that they can exploit to extract concessions from their European partners. And he's been willing to do so. He's been doing it within NATO. He's been trying to do it over Ukraine. And I do think Trump will try to do the same by saying, okay, you want any assistance from us in Ukraine? You have to help us out in Iran. It's not as easy as that. Not that I think coercion is not going to work. I think coercion is likely going to work, but not in the way that Trump wants. The problem with coercion, the problem with overplaying that hand of weaponized interdependence, is that effectively, if that interdependence, which was based on consensus, was based on a benign relationship, is now being weaponized and becomes coercive, the other party, in this case the Europeans, will try to disentangle from this relationship because they're always on the receiving end. And we're seeing a lot of this happening already. A lot is being invested into security and European defense domestically, trying to plan for a future without the United States. And that's not just Trump related. The problem is Europe is not ready. It will take at least another 5 years to get to a place where it can defend itself, maybe even longer, considering the contraction that we have in the economies in Europe. But the problem I think that we see that Trump will find is there's very little that European powers can do right now in terms of the capacity that they can offer to open up the straits, which is essentially what Trump is asking for. First of all, I don't think there's a military solution to opening up the straits. There's only going to be a diplomatic one. There is no way that military deterrence is deterring a couple of local networked cells who have all kinds of UAVs or USVs, like maritime drones, that they will be deterred from attacking whatever expensive maritime platform you're going to put there, and will try to do so and will potentially succeed. And I don't think there's a navy in the world right now that will go through the strait without having an agreement first from the Iran-GCC and a green light to do so. And so if that's the case, then, if that's not the case, you don't have a green light, no navy is going to go there. If you have a green light, the navy is not really going to do much. And I cannot see in this context that Israeli or American assets going through the straits. And I'm saying this can be shipping companies that are co-owned by a company that has some Israeli on board or some American guy on board, or there's a minority investor in that shipping company that's American. That be sufficient for the Iranians to say, we're going to attack the vessel. There's nothing a navy is going to do about it. There's nothing the Royal Navy can do about it. And mind you, the last minesweeping ship that we used to have in the Gulf, the Royal Navy had in the Gulf, had to basically be pulled, I think, on back of another bigger ship because it was no longer, going into water, had to be pulled back all the way into the UK. So what we have now is here in the UK, and we need it here. We don't have anything to spare. And we're certainly not going to send our aircraft carriers down there because they're not going to do anything. And that's the most expensive piece of kit that we have militarily. So no, from the UK, there's nothing to offer. The French, I think, are probably the country that is, in Europe at least, they are the boldest in terms of saying no to Trump, and we're willing to sustain it. The Brits under Starmer, very much spineless, bending over backwards to please him. But I will now have to say, sorry, mate, we have nothing to offer. The Germans, obviously, most pro-Israel, most pro-American, again, spineless in many ways. But they have also nothing to offer, really. And they already said categorically, no, we're not going to do it. I just don't think there's anything Europe can offer at this point. And then what's Trump going to do about it? I think for now, Europe has to sustain his wrath.
Well, I'm very interested to see what happens with the Europeans. I don't think Trump is going to let that go, or the administration will let it go. I think he'll try to pressure, and we'll see what happens there. I'm also very interested to see what happens in Kharj. If what the reports, if we believe what's in the reports at least, and I mean, believing what comes out of this administration is very hard because many times it's contradictory. But that would be very interesting if there are troops in an island in the north part of the Arabian Persian Gulf, to have support from land or no ships to support them. That would be very strange. And to not also control the shore, the Iranian shore from the other side is also, I mean, it goes against all the, joint publication doctrines from NATO, and you're an academic, you know this very well from the defense perspective. So I'm very interested to see that and see how that goes. As someone who studies and worked and have spent 3 decades in this, I'm very interested in this. As a citizen, I don't want to see that at all, obviously. I want to see an end to the war. Now, I did tell you...
It's a massive experiment. All of this is a massive experiment.
Yes. Now, I did tell you that was the last question. I do promise it's the last question. However, we need to have you back again to have a wider discussion on whatever happens later in the Gulf. And also, the Bab el-Mandeb, that is an issue that with the Strait of Hormuz could create a much bigger issue. Now you're not only choking, 80% of the Saudi oil, but 100% of the Saudi oil and all of the Gulf. And now you're affecting a much wider global market by looking at goods, and insurance will just skyrocket. So that's something I think we should talk about if you're willing to come back again. Dr. Andreas Krieg, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Nawaf, thank you very much.